Welcome back to Palestine Solidarity announcements for August 23rd, 2024. If you're new to these PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join ongoing solidarity work. If you're returning, thanks again for sticking with us. Please share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. And as always, the recordings are available on YouTube on CPE's channel. Navigating disillusionment has become a bit of a martial art these days. More than 10 months ago, we first mobilized en masse and with unquenchable ferocity in the earliest stages of the emerging genocide in Gaza. Activated by our natural human impulses of empathy and summoned from the stupor of life in empire by the slaughter of innocents, we attacked Zionist hegemony head on, blocking and parrying the cynicism and authoritarianism of our militaristic society to say, ceasefire now. But each image from Gaza, more gruesome than the last, felt like a link in a chain of napalm girls. And I'm alluding to the infamous napalm girl photo from the Vietnam War that helped turn public opinion against it. But unlike that singular image, these images were far more detailed, far more shocking, and far more ubiquitous in our always plugged in society. Amidst all the monsters we've witnessed since the start of this brutal violence, from Israeli occupation to the US war machine, perhaps none have been as nefarious as disillusionment itself. Why weren't these images and stories of families of incinerated or mangled children, infants, enough to stop the bombs? Yesterday, at the close of the Democratic National Convention, Kamala Harris said that she wanted to see Palestinians realize their, quote, rights to self determination, dignity, security, and freedom. I know it's hard to believe, but this phrase is nearly identical to words used by President Joe Biden during his nearly year long and full throated support for genocide in Gaza. That is to say, these words are functionally meaningless without real indications that a change in Gaza policy is in play. They were also buried behind acutely hawkish, belligerent promises to maintain unmitigated military support for Israel and to keep the US military the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world, as Kamala Harris said. And most of all, they came after hours and hours of speakers who talked about fighting fascism and reinfusing joy and multiracial democracy into American life, even as the party refused to allow a single Palestinian American to speak on the convention stage. Where exactly the uncommitted movement goes from here isn't entirely clear. Abbas Alawiya, one of its co founders and a longtime Democratic political operative, sounded exasperated as he staged a sit in during the DNC after learning that his request to have a Palestinian address the convention was, for a final time, going to be denied. How do the more than 700,000 voters who voted uncommitted, especially those in swing states, leverage their power now that the play of using uncommitted delegates has not pushed Harris or the Biden administration to take practical steps towards ending U.S. military support that enables the genocide of Palestinians? Undoubtedly, organizers will have to contend with disillusionment within the ranks of the uncommitted movement and critique from those who've long disavowed inside outside strategies as a fool's errand. And in fact, there may be real disagreements about organizing strategy that appear to have sharpened in light of the Democrats' disgraceful treatment of the Palestinian solidarity movement this week. But to dismiss these efforts without assessing their strengths and pitfalls, including, of course, how they can play into a counterinsurgency playbook, and using that information to forge a strategic direction for the next few months, would be a capitulation to the disillusionment that we frankly cannot afford to countenance at this moment. One of the most powerful testimonies to this has come from frontline physicians who've done life saving work in Gaza for months, and several of whom were present at the DNC and pushing party members to address the urgency of stopping this inhuman carnage. That includes Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan, one of the co founders of Gaza Medic Voices and one of the earliest public voices from the medical community in the media to share firsthand accounts of what was happening on the ground. It also includes Dr. Tahir Ahmad, a Palestinian American doctor from Chicago who had traveled to Gaza earlier this year and who famously walked out of the meeting with President Joe Biden in April to show solidarity with his grieving community and express frustration at Biden's failure to listen to Palestinian concerns and stop the genocide. I'd like to play a small clip of those physicians who accompanied some of the uncommitted delegation to Chicago that I think serves as a poignant reminder of our commitment to combat disillusionment and continue fighting vigorously to end U.S. complicity, to stop the bombs, and to ensure a free Palestine for the future.
How do you have the energy to work here?
Rage. I'm fueled by a lot of rage.
I was in Gaza working in the ICU in Al-Aqsa Shuhada Hospital for about 3 weeks.
I have been to Gaza twice since the assault began in October.
Went to Gaza in January and was turned away in May after the border was stormed.
I was in Gaza earlier this year and multiple times over the past decade.
As a physician and as a witness on the ground, as one of the few international eyes allowed in Gaza by design, what I saw was indescribable with any other word other than genocide.
I, as a doctor, cannot do my job if my elected leaders and my politicians are making it literally impossible for me to treat patients. I can't save lives if you keep sending weapons.
And it's really tough to reconcile with the fact that you're in the hospitals, you're watching people suffer and die, and to know that overhead there are fighter jets that came from America.
They're making Gaza unlivable. They've destroyed the water infrastructure, and so we were seeing kids die of diarrheal illness. They prevented all medical supplies in, and I can tell that by firsthand witness, not by hearsay. They refused me the medical supplies that I was able to gather over months from wonderful people in Arkansas, things like endotracheal tubes and Foley catheters, things like antibiotics and sedative medications that were denied at the border. Firsthand experience. They do not allow medical supplies into children that are dying.
You heard my colleagues speak just now at the press conference. The fact that these children haunt us in our dreams, the fact that their parents come to us in our dreams, asking us why we didn't save their children.
There's definitely a cognitive dissonance that's required to go from a place where you see children die every day from bombs dropped with Made in USA sign on them, then to come here to the DNC and see almost a party-like atmosphere, ignoring the fact that every day I was in Gaza, I heard children crying for their parents that were gone.
I saw the reality on the ground. I saw the product of our policies. I saw the product of the Biden administration's policies here. And for anybody to suggest that this is just a one issue, or we don't want to make this a one issue vote, I'm offended by that, and I think most people who recognize the tragedy of what's taking place in Gaza, they're offended by that.
And I think all of us are here not because we want to be, we're here because we feel like it's our responsibility, and we feel like we're accountable. We're accountable to all the civilians who were killed, who were injured, who are killed today, who will be killed tomorrow unless the U.S. stops funding this. We are enabling a genocide, and that should be front and center stage at a convention of one of the main two parties of a country's political system.
You know, that's great. Yeah, I don't have any capacity to give anybody excuses anymore. I literally can't. Like, there's no excuse. Yeah.
We'll ground ourselves with Melissa and review the week's headlines with Samar in a moment, but I want to put a finer point on the urgency that drives our solidarity movement at the moment. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs publishes regular updates on the humanitarian situation on the ground. And as of today, more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. Nearly all of Gazans have been internally displaced, and 500,000 are facing the highest, most catastrophic levels of food insecurity. As we mentioned before on this program, passing any threshold of deaths is almost certainly a vast undercount. Conservatively, this number doesn't include the 10,000 reported missing and the thousands that are likely unreported as missing, and the thousands living in humanitarian precarity who are facing certain death without any alleviation of hunger or disease on the horizon. As the Lancet, the study we discussed several weeks ago, would suggest, this number is probably incredibly higher. This graph does appear to show some leveling off of fatalities since October, but even if that's the case, there is important context here. Even as the rate has decreased, we still saw 1,500 people dead in Gaza last month. In addition, there is ever-increasing risk of death from disease and starvation. And finally, the vulnerability of children is acutely high. Of the more than 32,000 identified as deceased since the start of the genocide, a full third of them are children, over 10,000. And of course, the death toll doesn't account for those injured, permanently maimed, and disabled by the violence of this war. That number for those physically injured, notwithstanding emotional damage, is upwards of 90,000 people. In addition to being massacred, Gazans are experiencing a polycrisis of displacement, starvation, and disease. Nearly the entire population now faces food insecurity. The means to feed that population has been severely damaged internally, and diseases are affecting the vast majority of those on the ground, in addition to the emerging threat of polio that the UN has identified this week. There are fewer and fewer homes to return to or places of business to restart Gaza's economy. This week, we saw more horrific images of disfigured and dismembered children, including a beheaded baby and toddler with their head blown open. Children in Gaza are suffering at incalculable levels. Most small babies and children are not meeting their nutritional needs. Thousands need treatment for malnutrition. Hundreds of thousands have no access to education. And most need serious mental health support. And tens of thousands are now unaccompanied, orphaned by the US weapons of war that we send to Israel on a regular basis. This is the sobering reality that should have been the backdrop to a political gathering that took place this week in Chicago, that instead turned into a spectacle and lies and chicanery of the highest order. It's also what pushes the Palestine solidarity movement through disillusionment and into necessary action. So thank you all for sticking with us to stay informed every week and to stay mobilized. To help us attune ourselves to the resilience we need to stay engaged in our solidarity work, here's somatics practitioner Melissa Fan. Melissa, welcome back.
Thank you, Thomas. Wow, hearing that those doctors speak in that video, I'm noticing in myself just this great surge and welling of grief coming up. And so I'm curious if you're feeling that too. And permission to feel that deep grief. Not trying to push it away or shove it down. It's here. It's here because it's necessary. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the importance of vision, discernment, and alignment. Without the right framework of understanding, every single somatic practice that we do can be easily co-opted by systems of oppression for their own gain. I don't know if y'all remember this, but back in November or December, there was a video going around of a self-proclaimed Zen master who was teaching mindfulness to IDF soldiers so they could be better at genocide. As disgusting as this was, it wasn't surprising because appropriation, co-optation, spiritual bypassing, these are all old tools of colonization. It's the vision behind the practices, the discernment about which practices are in service to what, and the alignment between vision, theory, and action, which matter. And these are continual processes that we have to engage in every single day. So, keeping this in mind and in heart, let's continue to hone our collective visions. All right, finding yourself in your body in this moment, feeling rage, feeling grief, feeling overwhelm or numb, all of it is welcome. Noticing the pace of your heart. And letting your breath guide you all the way down to your feet, to your lowest extremity. And doing a couple of taps or wiggles from one side to the other. Left side, right side, left side, right side. Yeah, just trying to call all of our body back to us, back online. A couple of times we've practiced this collective vision of imagining a free Palestine. And so let's continue that practice. Imagining now Palestine is free. It's 200 years into the future. What do you imagine? And your vision doesn't have to be super sharp or clear. It can be hazy. And you'll notice that the vision fills in community. As I deepen into my own practice of disability justice, I begin to imagine what a free Palestine looks like through that lens. Knowing that there will be a lot of amputees, a lot of people with physical and mental disabilities. What does it look like to rebuild Palestine with that framework? And broadening out a little bit, maybe further away or maybe even closer. For Palestine to be free, what else has to be free? Knowing that all of our liberation is intertwined and connected. When Palestine is free, what else is free? Breathing, remembering to return to your breath here. Trusting your body to know the pace, of breathing that keeps this vision alive. And as an invitation to you to deepen in this practice throughout the rest of this week, keep envisioning, keep honing. When Palestine is free, what else is free? And what steps do you need to take to get there? Knowing that none of us are going to be alive in 200 years. And so, what are the steps that we're taking now and passing on to the future generations? Seeding those visions. Breathing in once again. Thank you for practicing with me today.
Thank you, Melissa. Um, And now we'll bring Samar up to run through this week's updates and news stories and headlines. Samar, what transpired at the DNC this week feels like it represents another key turning point. I know, how many turning points can you possibly have? Uh, and I know you'll get onto all the details in a second, but I wonder, even just off the bat, if you've made sense of it yet, or you still feel like we need a few days before it's clear whether and how this moment of perceived disillusionment about engaging internally might be galvanizing in some other way.
It's a great question. Obviously, I've been sitting with this for the past day. I think a lot of us probably have. And it's a weird combo, you're right? Because I feel like we don't want to give too much weight to the Democratic Party, which was never an institution that I think we had a lot of faith in. And like even with those very low expectations, this was a really disastrous showing for them. And I think, yeah, it's hard to sit with. Um, and I think it cuts a few different ways, which I will hopefully get to at some point in the slides. So we'll see. I am definitely still making sense of it, but I have some thoughts to share, at least, if not a framework that you can actually take. My apologies.
Appreciate it. All is yours.
Uh, thanks. So, yeah, I really appreciated your setting the scene at the beginning there, Thomas. I think that was really, really helpful. And yeah, as somebody who I am like, as someone who is currently struggling with how to feel about all of this, it helped to hear your take on all of it. We do have a lot to get through, so just to jump into the things, Thomas did a wonderful job going over some of the complexities of the death toll and civilian casualties in Gaza. So we can bypass that today, I think. As we usually do, seeing what's happening in Gaza, starting from the bottom and working our way up. It's been a big week in Rafah. This is the week that the IDF is claiming that they have like successfully managed to take control of Rafah just this week. Meaning, it's been 2.5 months at this point for what was supposed to be a quick and limited operation. And only now are they even claiming to have operational control in Rafah. And whether or not that's actually true is a bit of a different story. And, it's been a particularly heavy week for Israeli casualties too. So there were some IDF soldiers killed in Rafah, as well as a little further north in Khan Yunis, which, was the sort of big area of Israeli army offensives in the past few weeks, and that has now started winding down. The big thing that came out of Khan Yunis this week was, of course, the IDF retrieving the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages, surprisingly uncovered in the U.S. press, but actually covered quite a bit in Israeli media. I did include a link to the article in Hebrew in the slide, like notes, is that like even very preliminary forensics have shown that those 6 hostages were killed by Israeli bombardment. And so the IDF killed them and then retrieved the bodies of the people that they had killed. Which, it is part and parcel, I think, of the way that they've been conducting this operation. So it's not surprising, but, even their wins at this point are sort of recognition of the ways things are going a little pear-shaped. Moving up a little bit, the area where the most is happening this week is definitely Deir al-Balah, which is in central Gaza. This is the new evacuation zone. So, last week, the week before, it was Khan Yunis, and now it's in Deir al-Balah, which is up to this point the most unscathed part of Gaza. So, like, obviously, Deir al-Balah has been bombed a lot over the past 8 months. Sorry, 10 months. But compared to other major urban areas in Gaza, it's actually seen very little. And now the IDF is moving into this like basically the final built up area that they haven't really moved in at that level of ferocity yet. And just to note that like because people have been evacuated from everywhere else, Deir el-Belah is now like that area is the most crowded displacement camp in world history. Consider how densely populated Gaza was before October, where Gaza in its entirety was one of the most densely populated places on Earth. And you can see here on the map, all these areas in light blue, which are evacuation zones. So like people aren't allowed to be in any of those areas, and they're expected to be mostly crammed into the green area, with some remaining in the like the beige areas, which aren't really populated. Like it doesn't have residential infrastructure. And you can see in darker blue the Deir el-Belah offensive location there. There's a lot happening in Deir el-Belah, without getting into all of the sort of like operational details. I just want to note two high level things. One, the sort of ongoing feeling of powerlessness and frustration for Palestinians who are now being displaced for some of them like the 10th or 11th or 12th time. And that constant movement and that constant fear that comes with it is just like it's hard to really wrap your head around. And alongside that, the worsening health situation that Thomas mentioned right at the top, where in Deir el-Belah now we've polio has been officially detected. Like it's been known for a little while that it was in wastewater, but now we've found actual people with polio. So these like eradicated diseases are making a huge comeback in Gaza that will not only obviously haunt Gaza for years to come, but will spread. This is going to be a stain on the world, as we fail to sort of contain any of it. I wanted to note one last thing about Deir el-Belah and some of the fighting that's happening around there, because I was struck by this announcement a few days ago about 4 Hamas fighters who infiltrated that like security zone that Israel has built across Gaza right above Deir el-Belah, where they like blew up some jeeps and killed some soldiers, which not anything particularly new, but Hamas is claiming that all 4 of the fighters engaged in this operation were recruited, not just trained, but recruited this year, which I think really speaks to the underlying logistical impossibility of Israel's operations. Yeah, that like every action they commit just leads to more resistance to them. This is a thing that's been showing up in a lot of both U.S. and Israeli military intelligence. We looked at the New York Times article that was talking about this last week, where unsurprisingly, given the way that Israel is acting, there's no shortage of people who are very keen to fight them. So it's sort of creating this impossible cycle for Israel to win. All the way up north in Gaza City, yet another attack on a school, where several students, a bunch of children, and others were killed. And in Gaza City, what we're seeing is what looks to be a new Israeli military corridor. So the same thing as this like Netzarim corridor that they established a while back, that cuts across Gaza, that went to where the failed US aid port was. They seem to be building another corridor that will cut across the Gaza Strip further north up in Gaza City. And forensic architecture, which does incredible research into these things, calls it infrastructural indications of permanent Israeli military presence, right? And this is something we're hearing in the ceasefire negotiations too, that the expectation is they get to keep these corridors, indefinitely. I wanted to take a moment to zoom back out a little bit, and refer you to this Bloomberg article if you hadn't seen it, because I think it was really quite remarkably done, that looks at the scale of devastation in Gaza just based on like the rubble, how much destruction the Israeli bombing and tank campaign has caused. And these are obviously just sort of unimaginably large numbers, 50,000 tons in the area the size of 2 New York City blocks. So imagine, 25,000 tons of rubble on a single block. And that's not even the worst of it, right? In certain areas, it's even more concentrated than that. But the other thing to note, I think, on this map from the Bloomberg article, you can see, Khan Yunis here in the middle and Gaza City at the top, and the area in between those two is Deir el-Balah. And that gives you a sense, I think, of like how much it has managed to largely avoid the scale of destruction that has happened elsewhere, and that is now being wrought in Deir el-Balah. In the context of all of this, the ceasefire negotiations are ongoing, sort of. They claim to be ongoing, and the big news of the past week is that the United States has endorsed what they're calling a bridging proposal that basically tries to meet that, according to the way that they described it, is trying to meet both Israeli and Hamas demands. But again, we don't actually ever get to see any of these proposals. They're not like public anywhere, but you get leaks here and there, so you can get little bits and pieces. Hamas released some documents showing what the U.S. bridging proposal was, which you can see here on the right is taken from a different article, which would be that Israel remains at the Egypt-Gaza border in the Philadelphia corridor and at the Netzarim corridor, and they get to stay there, but with a reduced presence. And that the PA would manage the border under Israeli supervision, whatever that means. And then, a series of things about Israel vetoing political prisoners who are supposed to be released, and that Israel never fully withdrawing from the Gaza Strip. So, like, Israel would not be expected to withdraw fully from the Gaza Strip. And that a permanent end of the hostilities won't even be discussed until the second phase of the ceasefire negotiations. So you might be hearing all of these points and thinking, bridging what? Because they're clearly not bridging between what Hamas had agreed to in the previous ceasefire agreement and what is like Israel generally and Netanyahu specifically are demanding. The way I heard this described that I think sums it up accurately is that it's a bridging proposal between the Israeli position and the US position. They're not really considering the Hamas position at all. And as a reminder, the ceasefire proposal accepted by Hamas was what Joe Biden referred to as the Israeli proposal, right? The idea was that Israel made that proposal, and that when Hamas accepted it, Israel said no to it. And now here we are with the bridging proposal, which just introduces a series of terms that there's literally no way Hamas will accept. Like, they've made it abundantly clear they will never accept these terms. So this ceasefire negotiation is dead in the water. How it moves, I don't really know. And you can sort of get a sense of how the US is sort of grappling with this idea of a failed ceasefire negotiation that's very obviously Israel's fault. On the left, you see that Blinken says that Israel agreed to the ceasefire plan and that, now it's on Hamas to do the same. The article on the right, the BBC article, is 2 days after that AP article. And it says that Biden is pressuring Netanyahu to sign a ceasefire deal. So, like, it may not make sense that they both have ostensibly agreed to the proposal and need to be pressured to agree to the proposal, which I'm sure folks can ascertain what's happening there. And just to note that, Blinken has said multiple times that the Israelis have agreed to this bridge proposal, but Netanyahu has not. Right, so like this is the U.S. once again, as they did with the last round of ceasefire negotiations, saying Israel's okay with it, but we're not hearing that directly from Israel. This like new ceasefire proposal and the willingness to sort of bend even more than they had been towards the Israeli position is something we've been seeing accelerating, right? Last week we saw the release of all of those arms deals and sales and the distribution of the congressional weapons grant assistance. And all of that was done, more or less in concert with this last round of ceasefire negotiations. So it seems to be, and like this New York Times article on the right goes into this a little bit, that the Biden administration ostensibly, was sort of delaying these $20 billion arms sales, but felt like this was a strategic moment to release them. And, the most generous interpretation of that, I think, is that it's the same sort of failed Biden administration attempt for the past 10 months, which is let's give the Israelis what they want and then hope that they do what we want. And that has worked 0 times. So there's no reason to think that it will work this time. But I'm sure I'm not alone in seeing what feels like a really marked shift towards like a stronger position backing the Israeli military and the Israeli state. And another example of that is that this State Department position that heads Israeli policy, which is vacant because the last person in that position resigned because of the Biden administration's like unwillingness to recognize the genocide happening in Gaza, has now been like a hardline Zionist has taken that position. So that itself, I think, is an indication of where the Biden administration is at on this, and it's not good. Meanwhile, it's very clear in Israeli media, as well as global anywhere but here media, that it's Israeli demands that are blocking the truce deal. That's also something that the Israeli negotiators are saying. And there's been a series of leaks from those negotiators saying it's Netanyahu who's forcing us to hold on to this Philadelphia corridor stuff. And knowing that it's a non-starter, right? So presumably the negotiators are actually trying to negotiate a ceasefire agreement. Maybe. But for sure, Netanyahu doesn't want one. And it's very clear that he's purposely sabotaging those talks in ways that we've talked about before. And just to note very, very quickly that this acceleration is leading to a series of potential legal complicity issues, both for the US and Israel. Whether anyone will ever act on those is, of course, a different question. But with the ICJ rulings, there are an increasing number of legal scholars saying that the US and other countries that are providing not just weapons, but oil, and other logistical shipments that support the war effort, could be guilty of complicity in genocide. Similarly, Israel was freaking out over it being caught doing foreign government advocacy in the United States. It's a fascinating article. If you haven't read it, I really highly recommend it. It's based on, this hacked internal communications from the Israeli Ministry of Justice, which I would love to get my hands on. I don't know if folks have actually seen those documents, but I would really like to see them. I haven't looked very hard, but they've got to be somewhere. A big part of it is them worrying that all the NGOs that they're secretly financing would be revealed as agents of a foreign government. So boy, oh boy, I would love the list of what organizations they've been financing, though I can guess. And then moving into the DNC, I can't believe this picture is real. Thomas did a really wonderful job talking about the really moving event that the Uncommitted movement put on with those doctors who went to Gaza. So I am skipping all of that. And I did want to reflect on what felt like the first sign that things were going to go really badly at the DNC, which was their new party platform, which was released earlier this week. Basically, ghost written by AIPAC, like an unbelievably atrocious set of statements on Palestine and what's happening in Gaza, and really strong condemnations of Hamas, and basically not a word about how Israel has conducted itself for 10 months, including putting front and center the allegations of sexual violence that continue to sort of exist in a sort of miasma of misinformation and hearsay versus obviously not a single word about the documented and proven um, severe sexual violence and rape being committed by Israeli soldiers on Palestinians. Like, don't even they don't even come close to talking about that. So this looked like a really bad sign. Um, the DNC platform openly brags about flouting the UN to support and defend Israel. So like that's not great. And then from there, the big sort of fiasco from the last couple of days was, of course, the uncommitted movement basically asking for somebody to represent Palestinian people to get an opportunity to speak. And I think we can all agree like that's a very small ask in the grand scheme of things, like not something that changes the material conditions, not something that moves beyond the realm of narrative. Um, but even that level of ask was completely shot down. And not only shot down, but shut down in a way that like they then tried to sort of gaslight people into saying like, oh no, like we did want this person to speak, but the uncommitted movement turned her down, which is like definitively false, like provably false. Um, and the speech that she was supposed to give, this Palestinian woman from Georgia, is available in this Rolling Stone article. You can read it. It is very mild. So like a pre-prepared, pre-vetted speech that was designed to endorse Kamala Harris was still too much for them. Um, and yeah, there's more to say about this, which I think we can come back to in a bit. But I did want to touch on some of the reactions to all of what was happening there. There was uh, Ilhan Omar showed up and said, I think a thing a lot of us have been thinking, which was, it's clear that the Democratic Party has this tagline now about working tirelessly for a ceasefire, which is something they kept saying over and over at the DNC. And Ilhan Omar was just like, uh, it's, you know, working tirelessly is not really a thing. All you have to do is stop sending weapons. If you want a ceasefire, you can get it tomorrow. We just have to stop sending those weapons. Um, and like sort of at the polar other side of that was all the other DNC delegates who literally plugged up their ears um, to like avoid hearing like the names of Palestinian dead children or like documented war crimes that Israel is committing, which I feel like really sums up the DNC kind of well. I wanted to zoom out a little bit and talk about how this fits into a kind of broader historical context. Firstly, if folks didn't see Ta-Nehisi Coates' new article in Vanity Fair, I would definitely recommend it. I thought it was beautifully written. I feel like Ta-Nehisi Coates hasn't been writing about like political stuff for a little while, so it's nice to see him back and doing it about Palestine. Yeah, he does a really good job of like talking about the fear that the Democratic Party has of putting a Palestinian on the stage, and the way that, in a certain sense, that fear is warranted because, like, you know, like it almost feels inconceivable that a Palestinian could get on that stage and not say some things that really, really need to be said. Like, I know if I had an opportunity to go up there, I'd say a lot more than what was in that vetted speech. So, yeah, I think it's a real indictment, right, of the way that the Democratic Party has handled itself. That, like, even the possibility of someone talking about how the Democrats have behaved vis-a-vis Palestine is like way beyond the pale because it's too embarrassing for them. Um, but the other article I wanted to uplift was the one on the left, which I think speaks to a certain parallel thing that's happening, uh, where at the convention 60 years ago in 1964, there was a giant fight on the floor of the DNC about particularly the Mississippi delegation being able to uh, have a integrated, as in non-segregated delegation seated at the convention, and they lost that fight, right? So like their attempt to get seated was rebuffed by the Democratic Party at that time. But that set in motion a series of things that led to a pretty big sea change in the way that the Democratic Party managed issues of um, like Jim Crow, racial segregation stuff. So important for us, I think, to like look beyond what exactly came out of this moment and more what the inputs from this moment are causing in the long run, right? Like how are we changing the overall narrative and scope? And the one pick me up I got from that whole thing in that mind frame of thinking about how things might be looking a little different was this Slate article about from the author who went to a Zionist Democrats party at the DNC and how like weak and deflated it was, and how like most of the speakers didn't even show up, and the ones who were there were like unable to sort of articulate anything. So, um, like his take, maybe a very optimistic one is that, um, like this really demonstrates that the Democratic Party can't hold that position coherently any longer, but like, leave it to the Democrats to do something incoherent, for years longer than they should. Since I spent a lot of time talking about the Democrats, I did think it was important to touch on the other parties. So firstly, the lovely Trump news this week was him threatening to arrest and deport all quote unquote Hamas supporters. And also an incredible screed by Trump's ambassador to Israel, talking about how the DNC was like way too pro-Palestinian, because it mentioned Palestinian self-determination, for example. And like even just like Kamala Harris saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. He's like, well, that just means America determines what's appropriate and when Israel can use certain things, which like, yeah, they're US weapons, but just to say. And then also a quick moment to reflect on the big development from the Green Party this past week, which was Noura Ayrakat, friend of the show, uh, considering the nomination for vice president and then deciding to decline it based on a disagreement in strategy. And I found this particularly interesting and worth uplifting as folks think about how they want to use their own electoral power going forward, and like, the different aspects that need to be part of a strategic assessment of like what a voting strategy would or wouldn't look like. So the disagreement that Noura had with the party was largely around this idea that Noura said that I want the Green Party to withdraw from the race if the Democrats commit to an arms embargo, and her position on that basically being that the Green Party cannot win the election, right? That's not like within the scope of possibility. They're polling at 1%. But they play a really important role in either polling discourse of like the main parties towards a more tenable position, or failing that to provide a sort of foil for the way that both of those parties are failing to meet the expectations of their voter base. So I thought it was a very thoughtful and strategic engagement with the Green Party. And so, yeah, I don't know. Noura Ayrakat, friend of the show for a reason. A quick touch on the BDS updates this week. There have been many. The American Psychological Association put out a statement calling for a comprehensive permanent ceasefire. The Scottish government has decided that it will no longer have any meetings with Israeli government officials until Israel stops its war. The Colombian government, in a long-running thing that was finally implemented this week, has banned coal exports to Israel until it stops the war. And just like an hour before this PSA, I heard from a friend of mine that the American Sociological Association has not only like passed a very strong ceasefire resolution, but also divestment, where ASA has committed to divest all of its funds from anything that supports the Israeli military or the Israeli occupation. So big wins on both the international and the domestic front on the BDS side. A good reminder that, we shouldn't get lost at like the high narrative level. Big things are changing at like the medium level and the local level. I had just like a couple of high level things I wanted to leave you with, not to discuss, but in case anyone really wants to wonk out. I found this article from Carnegie really interesting. It basically looked at what leads to US foreign policy change, like given the sort of size and complexity of the US foreign policy apparatus, what historically has pushed a change through all those layers of resistance and bureaucracy and vested interests. So if you want to like think about how Palestine fits into those like historical fights, they pick 5 key variables, and we don't have most of those, unfortunately, but a good thing to reflect on how we can build power in some of those categories. And then my last high level leave you with something to think about later article was this remarkable piece yesterday in Haaretz written by a former major general of the IDF, who is predicting that Israel won't last another year, like as a state, at the current rate that it's going in the current trajectory that it's in. So, he does like breaks down like how the war in Gaza has failed, and then goes into a whole thing about how Israel is, quote, sinking deeper into the Gaza mud, because obviously, even though he thinks that Zionism is doomed, he's still a racist. But talks about, how soldiers, like IDF soldiers, are getting killed at higher rates. They failed to meet any of the war's objectives. Things are intensifying with Hezbollah and in the West Bank. Reservists are leaving the country, so it's getting harder and harder to pull in troops, and the economy is crashing. So like, even in these moments, I feel of sort of counter attack where our foes appear to be strong and controlling the narrative and things. We should remember that we have put them on their back foot, and there are many strategic opportunities there. So even the fights that don't feel great, and I'm not feeling great about what happened this week at the DNC and in Gaza, but I think there's still a lot to look to. So my quick sum up, like the Israeli military offensive in Gaza is clearly being turned towards long-term occupation. Can that occupation actually hold is a different question, but it's clear that no one is stopping it. And with the failure of the ceasefire negotiations, that's a very inevitable path that it seems to be heading down. The DNC was rough, but I think revealed some both fractures and really meaningful narrative changes. A way in which Palestine became this like really deep central existential issue for the party in a way that it never has been before. That's a win that I think we really need to hold, because it's easy to forget that 4 years ago, no one would have cared what a Palestinian delegation would have thought. And so to make this the level of embarrassment that it has been for the DNC is a really big deal, and I think says a lot about certainly a win in terms of how the movement has shifted the narrative window, but also points to some challenges in terms of how we're able to build real political power within these systems, which, needs to be done alongside building power outside of these systems. That's it. That's all my things. Some upcoming actions. The uncommitted folks have it's not a petition, it's like a calling tool. So if you fill out the thing, you can call the main like DNC organizers and tell them what you thought about the DNC. They're asking you to call them and say that it wasn't acceptable to not have a Palestinian speaker, but you're also welcome to call them and tell them some other things, if that's not the most important thing to you. And then I wanted to just like uplift some fundraising and like just being in community events that are happening over the next few weeks, including by our wonderful friend Mama Ganoush, who's organizing several of these events. You can find them all on the AROC calendar if you go to bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want text updates, please text PSA to the number below, 833-633-0604. And please subscribe to the PAL Media Tracker if you want more information on the articles that inform this analysis. And that's it.
Samer, thanks. Right under time. I actually feel like you did end us on a high note with that article about the warning about the collapsing Israeli economy and the sort of strategic document from Carnegie. I think that those are important questions. As I said at the top of the program, I think that there's a lot to unpack about where we've come and then where we've headed, both pro and deltas and pluses and minuses and deltas in terms of how to move forward. I did think one quick note is that I was doing a little research on Mira Resnick, who, and why this is being sort of flagged as a important appointment. And in a Hill article from October, just a few weeks afterwards, where they're interviewing her about these arms transfers that she's responsible for, she said about her tenure as the head of this division that is responsible for like billions of dollars in arms transfers, because the State Department, not Pentagon, is what's in charge of that. She said, "This was my goal in the beginning of my administration," she says, "to make sure that we could have a conventional arms transfer policy that reflected this administration's commitment to putting human rights at the center of our foreign policy." So the doublespeak and the kind of insane amounts of gymnastics, verbal gymnastics that we see have continued for many, many months. I I would say that maybe as we go into the next couple weeks, and we think about the Harris administration, it would be interesting to think about who some of the players are behind the scenes, that might constitute a new State Department. And we talked a little bit about her foreign policy advisor, and the comment about, how Harris would not be making a, change in position. And obviously some of her language in her speech seemed to indicate that at least some of the donors had spoken, about what needed to be said. Lockheed Martin stock went up quite a bit after that comment. So yeah, maybe in the next few weeks, we can also start to do a little bit of digging about what we anticipate in terms of her administration. But there's still a lot left in this race, and I think it's far from determined that Harris will be ahead, come the fall, even though the polling has suggested otherwise. I think the DNC is certainly a turning point, and let's see where it heads. Thanks to everyone, to Shante and Kat, for returning back to join us. It's wonderful to have them, and also for all of you for joining us. We'll be back again next week. Samara and I will actually be in Chicago for the Socialism Conference, so we'll be together and we'll figure out the logistics on how to do that then. But we expect to be back then, and if something comes up, we will let you all know in advance. But thanks for joining us. Reminder to share these out with your comrades, colleagues, and friends, and we will see you next week. And we'll try to stick around for a little bit, so that folks can have their questions answered. Thank you.